Hello, and welcome back. So, my name is Ambyes. We're going to be breaking down another few clips of the trailer. I wanted to say thank you so much for the subscribing. We got like 200 followers in 2 weeks, and that's just crazy. And so, thank you. I posted a short little intro video, basically just showing my face since I haven't in a while. And typically, I do voiceovers. So, thank you for following. I wanted to remind you guys that generally, I post art, not game videos, so just a heads up about that. I typically post shorts and long form art videos. If listening to someone talk about game theories or kind of what they think could be happening in the game or in the trailer, and that might upset you, feel free to click off. This is a very positive atmosphere. We have a lot of people who come here and just enjoy talking about the game in the comments. So if that sounds like you and you would like to join us, feel free to. I am currently about halfway through the trailer that I reordered, talking about why I think things are in that order, and also just in general what I think are happening in the scenes, and looking for clues and hints about what Hideo might have in store for us. So without further ado, let's get into it. We are finally getting close to Higgs's scenes. I'm not sure if we'll make it out of the Magellan today, but we can hope. Here we go.
Don't ask me. We've never met face to face. They value their privacy.
Seriously? No better than to believe that bullshit.
I've decided to kind of black and white these because they're a little bit easier to make out and to see. I've also lightened them a bit. I like that we get a better look at her outfit. We don't necessarily glean any new information from this, but I do think it's interesting. I've done a lot of analysis on the drawbridge logo and what it could represent and how it appears to have symbolism related to some other motifs in Death Stranding. I'm going to go ahead and talk about that here, just in case you haven't seen the other videos. But if you already know about the symbolism in the drawbridge logo, go ahead and fast forward and that would be fine. Back in 2022 or 2023, when we first got the posters for our characters, one of the things that caught my eye was the emblem on Tarman's hat. At the time, I thought he was the captain, so that's kind of how I referred to him. But basically, Tarman, his hat has chiralium hands, an anchor, as you can see, a tentacle or snake-like thing going up the anchor, and then, of course, it has the Magellan in that little logo patch. Initially, I was thinking, because he was helping with Tomorrow in the pod, that he was a doctor, possibly a person of medicine, and that made me think of the Greek god
Asclepius.
Basically, he was taught medicine by Cheron, a centaur, so half man, half person, and he's basically what you see when you see the medicine cross, and it has like the staff with a little snake around it. Now I think that it has something to do with Egyptian mythology, which I know a lot of people talk about the Egyptian theming of Higgs, but I'm not sure that what we've talked about so far is really like hitting the nail on the head. I'm going to circle back to Egyptian mythos, but first I want to point out Fragile's past and future logos and then compare those to Drawbridge and the Magellan logo. So the original logos for Fragile Express and then this initial logo that we've gotten for Tarman both have very similar shape language in the way that they are formed and presented. I think it's interesting that we have dead hands holding on to something that says fragile, and I think it's interesting that we have poisonous hands holding on to something like a creature, basically. I also think that there is a argument that where Fragile's Express's hands are expressly holding on to the fragile text, the chiral hands could be considered reaching or trying to grab the anchor that should hold you and keep you safe from things. Fragile's hands have had a little bit of a makeover. I'll try to find an image of that. But at the end of Death Stranding 1, you actually lose the skeleton, the bones, and it actually becomes covered hands. So it looks like actual flesh, living hands instead of skeletal hands. To point out, the biggest thing I saw was that it looked like a whale or a dolphin tail, the shape of the hands, especially the middle portion. And then whenever the hands become more human-like, I think it's even more obvious that there's sort of like a whale motif in there. But again, that's not uncommon. The game has lots of creatures. What's more uncommon to me is that we only see this particular outfit once. We see it at the very end of the game in Fragile's discussion with Sam about how he has reconnected and that he needs to come back, and basically she's just saying, like, you're one of us now. And then we never see that outfit again. I thought it was interesting that when flipped upside down, that these logos basically match up 1-to-1. I also thought it was really interesting that when viewed in this way, they are opposing, and I do wonder if that means anything for Fragile's character, if she will be the opposite of what she was in the first game. So just a theory craft for a moment, whenever you actually flip them right side up so you can read the words, you actually get a very interesting like womb-like imagery, which Death Stranding 1 was all about mothers and birth and kind of like connection and conception. And I won't get too into the details. There's no reason to get crazy, but I do think it's interesting that when you look at the drawbridge logo like this, it does seem to form some female genitalia. And the other thing is that is where a woman's womb is. It's lower body, and if you have hands that are cradling it, the odd thing is, to me, this feels like a still mother's sort of imagery. You have these basically dead hands cradling a place where typically life comes from. And to me, the lines, if we're going to look at this in a metaphorical or like image heavy way, the lines absolutely seem like umbilical cords, and the circular motion of the top of the drawbridge, which is technically the bottom at this moment, I just find it really interesting that, it looks like hips, it looks like a womb, it has this very womb-like concept to it. And so in Death Stranding 1, I think it's interesting that we had so many still mothers. I mean, they were the backbone of the game, and yet we really didn't see very many of them. Not really. The other thing I want to point out is that when you look at the drawbridge logo, I am curious if those lines are going to represent tomorrow in some way, because she kind of is. She has all those strings, and then we have the 3 strings there. These images are blurry because they were taken way back in the day before I cared about quality, but when you overlay them directly on top of each other, it's kind of an interesting thing, because you get, the chiral hands overlapping with the skeletal hands, which are both holding this womb-like imagery. But when we look at it with everything on top of each other, you get that anchor actually inside of the womb area, which is kind of fun because we know Lou already has tentacles. And of course, anchors were something that were talked about. It was like they talked about connection and like being each other's anchors. That was how they found each other. They had totems that had deep connected memories, and that was how they were able to jump to each other's beaches and carry items with them. So lastly, I just want to say that, an anchor has to be dropped in order to anchor you somewhere. It has to go through something else in order to form a connection. So again, back to that womb imagery, a baby must come out in order to form an anchor to the real world, to be on our plane, to basically anchor with its haw. So the theory crafting in me just says, I just think these logos represent the beach, the seam, and kind of the regular Death Stranding world. And I thought that was really interesting. So now let's move on to the Egyptian part that I think is kind of fun. So I'm going to place all the images on the screen, but there's a couple like major players. There's King Tutankhamun, there is Amun-Ra, there is the concept of the sun god, and there's some snake imagery. So let's start with that. So Apep Ankh is the name for basically the symbol in Egyptian culture where life and death is intertwined. Apep is a death god, and Ankh is the life god or sun god. I'm obviously not Egyptian. Well, maybe, I don't know. Maybe it's not that obvious, but I'm not Egyptian, and unfortunately, I don't have any like first world experience there. But I've done a lot of research on it, and so I'm hoping that this is correct. But if you know better, please comment and let me know. So Apep, who is the death god, was born of Ra's umbilical cord, but some of the basically primeval water spit him out is how the myth goes. And images of Ra, which would be the person who Apep came from, he came from Ra's umbilical cord is what they're saying. He carries a sun disk, and when you see pictures of the sun disk, it looks like an orange egg on his head, which is kind of funny because I immediately thought of BBs and how they're in those little orange pods and how they kind of look like an orange egg. And while I initially felt like Apep was going to be a metaphor for Higgs, I'm not so sure now that we have Tomorrow. It's possible that if Tomorrow and Lou really are Sam's children somehow, that's a whole nother theory. It's possible that they could be Apep, the death god. And I just want to say that this is thematically, not literally. So thematically, Tomorrow might be a death god, which would track because Amelie was an extinction entity, and that's basically a death god. What's kind of interesting, and the reason that I think it could involve Higgs just a little bit, is that Apep is often depicted as having desert and aquatic animals help him go after Ra, the sun god, which I would say is probably the best thematically related person would be Sam. So it's kind of fun to think of it that way. I kind of thought maybe that is what is around the anchor, is more of a snake instead of a like octopi. But then I also started thinking more about snakes and the fact that it looks so similar on the cross that I found for the life and death symbol for Egyptians. Uraeus is the infinity snake. Most of us know him as like Ouroborus, the snake that eats his tail and creates the infinity loop. So again, thematically, I just want to point some things out. Higgs is obsessed with King Tutankhamun in Death Stranding 1. The symbols that we see on his bunker at the end of the game are actually hieroglyphs from King Tutankhamun's coffin, or sarcophagus, his real life sarcophagus, and that was translated to mean the living image of Amun, ruler of Thebes. We talked a little bit about how Amelie was the extinction entity and a death god. The thing about Amun, who Higgs represents really, is that Amun went on to become Amun-Ra. He merged with the sun god. And while I do think Sam is very sun god coded, it makes the most sense to compare Higgs to Amun because he literally became one with Amelie, and so he became Amun-Ra, the most powerful and supreme, who represents both the mother, fertility, and the father, war. Now, Amun-Ra, who we are comparing Higgs to in Death Stranding 2, because he is a combination of himself and Amelie, we think, something like that, at least thematically. The thing about Amun-Ra is that even without Ra, he was still considered a king of gods. Higgs was obsessed with King Tutankhamun in Death Stranding 1. He modeled his entire image off of King Tutankhamun. On King Tutankhamun's sarcophagus is actually the first or the oldest known depiction of the infinity snake. So when we look at the anchor and we see this kind of infinity looking snake that is so similar to the life and death symbol on the Apep Ankh necklace, and then we kind of look at this other imagery, I think we can draw a conclusion that there's definitely something to that. And of course the beach represents death, the seam is purgatory, life is, where we are in the game right now. Kind of the last thing I wanted to point out that I had noticed is that Lu's bib has the angel wings, and we've talked a lot about what that could represent. But thematically with Egyptian mythos, the wings represent the sun disk, just like the orange egg on top of Ra's head in the image. The thing about the sun disk that's so interesting is that in Egyptian mythos, Ra carries this sun with him and basically has to fight off kind of the evil desert and water creatures in order to get it to its destination, which is basically Death Stranding 1's theme. People call it a walking simulator, but really that is if you were to put it in one sentence, that's the goal, to go from one point of the map to the other with this baby and make it out alive and fight off these creatures. So if Apep represents death, and perhaps that is going to represent tomorrow, and the sun disk or the sun represents Lu, and then we also have Amun, who kind of represents a powerful person who merges with a god. I mean, that sounds like Higgs to me. And then, if we circle back to some of the other things, like we have Ankh, who is the life god. I don't know who that could be. Maybe that's Sam. So to end this theory crafting and actually get back to what we were supposed to be doing, which is breaking down the trailer, I just want to mention that I do realize that there are a lot of motifs that Higgs has that relate him to the god of death, Osiris. But I think that those motifs are more generally used and less specific, because the eye symbols that we see for life and death on those gods are the same things that we see with the eyes and the tar and him drawing the symbol down his face after he licks Sam. So I think that if we were really going to link him to someone, we already have King Tutankhamun's headpiece that he adorns, that he makes a part of his whole outfit. And then the symbols that say, living image of Amun-Ra, which then Higgs becomes what we're calling homily, I guess. So anyway, thank you for listening to this theory. Back to the video.
This is the headquarters of our humble operation, the bridge of the DHV Magellan. It's always like this when the DHV Magellan's on the move.
Comically, I love that they have a fire extinguisher on board, because I feel like it's literally just for Fragile. She's smoking in closed quarters on a submarine. We have a few more Ethernet cables in the background. It appears that this is definitely a heavily wired up ship, which is great, because if you know anything about connections over airwaves, they're not very great. Bluetooth microphones versus a wired microphone, Wi-Fi versus an Ethernet connection, you get way better results when you can plug directly in. I feel confident saying that this is the same area that we see Rainy, that we see Tomorrow kind of listening into their conversation. You can see here that he does have his tattoo on his right hand. You can see it on the back of his palm. The thing I can't see is if he still has the tattoo on his right bicep. I can't really see it. And of course we still have his scar, which is good to note that it did not go away, so nothing too crazy has happened. I would really enjoy some more explanations of the physics in this game. For example, the tar is floating, which we can assume maybe that's because it has anti-gravity properties like the chiral matter in the first game, but that affected Sam in the first game. If you had so many kilograms of chiralium, then you would float. So I'm curious, is this like a spaceship and the spaceship is floating because of the chiralium amounts, just like you would float in space in a spaceship, but they're not floating because maybe there isn't a gravity generator? And will we get any confirmation of a gravity generator, or are we just supposed to assume that chiral matter only affects the gravity right beside it? And what happens if you stick your hand in it? Do you float? Does that part of your hand float? I would love to know more about the actual schematics of tar and the floating. I also apologize if you've been getting some ambiance in this video. I have my window open because it's such a nice day, but unfortunately I think we're gonna get wiped off the map with all the wind. It's so windy. I actually missed Dollman the first time I watched this trailer, so there he is. So he's been there since the beginning, even though I missed him. I'm also really curious about the steering wheel. I can't remember what this would even be called. It's comical, and I just want to point out that we know Tarman is steering the ship, so he's using his hand inside the computer. So there's really no need for us to have this old school pirate ship steering wheel. I feel like this is the equivalent of a Windows screensaver because it's just showing information on top of the steering wheel. When we see this scene from Tomorrow's point of view, I know that Sam is the one leaning against the railing. I'm pretty sure it's Fragile we see to his right because we can see the little TV in the middle. And then I would assume that Rainey would be sitting in that chair, and maybe the captain is over to the side in his own chair, because I've still had trouble figuring out that scene when they're all speaking about where she is from. When we see the part of the trailer where Dollman gets uppies, basically, he's pick me up, he puts his arms in the air and then they buckle him in. I'm pretty sure he's in that front seat. And then it took me a little bit, because it's hard to see what we're looking at really, to recognize that was the captain's hat that you can see over the peak of the chair. Now, the other thing that is kind of interesting is that on the floor there's this circle with a glowing white light, and it appears to be the same thing that Sam has in his room that we've seen from Hideo's Instagram where the music video plays. So I think we have a little hologram in the bottom of the floor.
Meet Tarman, our resident doctor and geophysicist. He's also the captain and pilot, in case you hadn't noticed. And a fellow doom sufferer. The nav console offers a direct connection to the tar currents. The downside being that we all have to bathe in chiralium.
I think it is so funny that Fragile has an ashtray right beside her. This is giving 70s industrial, before we realize that, hey, maybe we shouldn't have flaming things on, combustible things. Anyway, another thing that I think is fun is if you've ever watched the Alien franchise, you'll note that something they did and Star Wars did too is they really took inspiration from the current world. And so they looked at construction workers, and especially in Ridley Scott's Alien franchise, he was okay, I want the exploration of space to be so boring and mundane that it's being a trucker. It's just very normal, and that, very accessible. And I feel like that's kind of what Hideo is doing here. He's really tapping into that sci-fi genre of this is so normal that we have an ashtray sitting right there.
Happy to have you aboard, Sam. You'll have to excuse me if I don't shake your hand.
You steer this ship solo?
Yeah, though the computer does most of the work.
So this is a submarine?
Spot on. We dive into the tar and use it to travel underground.
Just beneath the surface of the Earth, there are currents we can ride almost anywhere.
So what's your role in all this?
I was wondering what the A and the B meant because the A is on the training room. So I'm assuming maybe the B. I don't think it means bridge because I don't know what A would mean for the first floor, but I do think the B just means we're on the second floor. And I'm kind of wondering if that is where we see most of like the doctoring scenes take place, like where Tomorrow might be in her pod. I'm fairly disappointed with the quality. This is the 4K download, but unfortunately the details are just really unclear, and I think maybe it's because of like the filter that being in the scene puts over the characters. I would like to give just one more theory. I always feel like you guys might be kind of tired of them, or you might be like, gosh, we don't care, but sorry, I just want to talk about the rings for a second. I've talked a lot about in my theory videos about how I think that it's interesting that in the first game Bridges gave us handcuffs and we were basically forced to form a bond with them, and then Fragile gave us her Masanga, I think is how you say it, and it was more of like a friendship bracelet. Like she reached out and we accepted. And then in this game we have the rings, and rings have often been considered like a form of like marriage or partnership. Now he is wearing it on his left hand. Of course he only has one hand, but he is wearing it on his middle finger. Rainy on the other hand wears it on her right pinky, and Tomorrow is wearing it on her left pinky. Now Sam wears it on his right thumb, and so does Fragile, which is odd. And then Hartman wears it on his left ring finger. I really thought that each person was going to have their own specific finger, but the fact that Sam and Fragile both have it on their right thumb kind of threw me. So I'm a little interested in that because Rainy and Tomorrow makes sense if they are like chirally symmetrical, like they're mirror images of each other. One has it on their right pinky, one has it on their left. But then with Fragile wearing it on second hands, that kind of threw me. So I don't know if there's anything to that or not. I fully expect for this cat to be like the best cat. I hope that it interrupts our conversations. I hope it follows you around. I hope we have a Red Dead sort of situation where we can overhear conversations and this thing is just like a menace. I hope we're having an extremely important conversation and the cat is just like howling in the background, because that is what cats do. And I'm hoping that this chiral creature is supposed to show us that even though they are technically monsters, that these creatures are just a product of their environment, and that hopefully we're going to see that the tar kitty is an example of them being able to live peacefully with us. Now, I have a theory that Tar Kitty actually ate Tarman's hand, and that's how we're able to travel back and forth. I think that Tarman has part of his body in the seam or the beach or the tar pits, and he lost his hand that way. At first I thought perhaps he lost it to like a BT whale, because that would be very Moby Dick of them to do. But I think it would be even crazier if this cat like straight up ate his hand and he was just like, you know what? It's not your fault. You're just a cat, you're just an animal. Like those hunters that get mauled by their exotic pets and they're like, no, it's just in his nature. Like I can't be mad at him for doing that. And I think it would be a really interesting theme if we get to see that we're no longer scared of the beach creatures, but we understand like they are just animals. They're doing what they have evolved to do. In the first game, we see BTs and that causes like a void out when they touch us or swallow us, basically. But on top of that, really the only time we are seeing the whales and the lion in the other game is when Higgs creates them, when he puts that skull like mask into their body, and then they chase us down. And so I'm wondering if we're going to find out that that is actually because they were being like forced into that, or being made by the mask somehow, possibly being influenced. I'm really excited to see more about the creatures. I really hope we can interact with Tar Kitty in some way.
Me? I make sure Drawbridge's grand plans go off without a hitch.
So you're the commander?
That's right. These days I'm fragile in name only.
Okay, first of all, she is the cutest person in the world. I love her. Secondly, I'm so nervous, and not because I think she's going to be a villain. I really don't think that she will be, but because her words ring so much like what Higgs said in the last game, when Higgs was helping Amelie, and Sam's like, you know, what are you getting out of this? Why are you doing this? And like, what's your job? And Higgs says,
What are you gonna do to her?
What I'm supposed to do? Keep the extinction entity safe until the slate is wiped clean.
So what's your role in all this?
Me? I make sure Drawbridge's grand plans go off without a hitch.
they're making me so worried. I feel like those two lines feel so similar. I just feel like that's going to be part of the "we didn't mean to lie to you or string you along" line. I really think she knows more than she's telling us at this moment. So she gets that cigarette out of what appears to be kind of like a case, almost like you would carry cigars in, but you can't actually see the case and there's no markings. And I feel like this was a missed opportunity for her to roll her own cigarettes. These are clearly pre-made, which I find odd because they've made her character revolve around smoking in this game. Even the logo on some of the vehicles show her smoking. So I think it's a little strange that she would buy like unbranded pre-rolled cigarettes. When she snaps her fingers, I'm assuming it's static electricity that lights it, because you can't actually see any flame come out of her glove. It's literally like a static electricity moment. I'm really interested in what these gloves are capable of. Is that really the only trick that they can kind of set off combustible items, or is there going to be more than just it giving the peace sign and holding its hands over her face? When this first came out, a lot of people noticed that the smoke comes out kind of like little BTs, which I don't think is going to mean anything. I think it's just supposed to be fun. Again, this really is leading me to think that Fragile might not be completely alive, that her ha and her caw may have separated. Perhaps her caw is in second hands. The reason I say that is because we know that putting chiral matter into your body is kind of like putting asbestos into your body. Like, it's not good, and you're probably going to get cancer. That's one of the reasons that, like, Bridget had uterine cancer, is like the raised amount of chiralium in the air caused radiation, basically, and gave people cancer. And so one of the bad things about us building with chiral printing is that we are literally making things worse. And I think Hideo does this on purpose, because he's wanting to bring light to the fact that we often do things that destroy our bodies, destroy the environment, and, you know, we do things for pleasure, but then they end up hurting ourselves and the planet in the process. However, if you are like Mama, perhaps, and you no longer have a caw in your haw, and maybe you're not aging the way that you should, it would be interesting. I mean, you wouldn't really care what you were putting into your body if your body no longer needed to be utilized in the same way. So just food for thought. Famously, the only other person that I can remember that seeing smoke was Cliff in the Nightmare Landscape. And this just cracked me up because we don't know if this is before or after Sam and Fragile have been kissing or whatever they're doing, but he looks so down bad for her. Literally all she did was light a cigarette, and Sam looks like he's gonna jump her bones, which is so comical to me. Like, dear Sam, like, I know it's been 10 years, but calm down. The other thing is like their breathing. We see that they're kind of blowing out a mist. So I do wonder, is it really cold on the ship, or is that just, because they're under the ground? Is it just to show that they're in the seam, or is it actually cold? Because if it is actually cold, like, where's this man's shirt? Why is no one giving him a shirt? Everybody else is dressed fairly warmly. They have a lot of layers so far that we've seen. Except for Tomorrow and Rainy, who both are in like shorts and a dress. And so I'm just curious, does the mist from their breath come solely from the fact that they're in the seam, or is it cold? I need to know. Not just because the sci-fi-ness interests me, but because, the dead are often associated with coldness. That's kind of how you know that the BTs are around whenever you're in DS1. Like, you kind of are like, and then it gets cold, and then, or I assume it gets cold, and then you see your breath. So it would be really neat to have another nod to the fact that when you're in the tar currents or the seam, you're closer to the dead, and therefore it's very cold. So I want you to look at the background of this photo and then this clip.
Well?
I feel like we are meant to assume that that is not, after the Magellan, that is when he comes home and he finds the attack on Lou. The only thing that's holding me back from believing that, other than the fact that he is missing the ring, which is curious, is that we see that pod in the bedroom where he speaks to Deadman, as well as like right now. And I wouldn't put it past Hideo to have the octopus thing happening on the Magellan, because they're in the seam, and it would make sense that other beach things could communicate through these pods that are kind of like connections to the other side. The reason I'm not sure that this is actually Lou's original pod that we see with the octopus stuff is because in the clip here, you can actually see that it says like lock tight right there by the little triangle. And I don't see it on this one, which makes me think, is this an older model? Is this one that Fragile has just found and they've put on the ship? I'm curious about that. So let me know if you have any ideas about the pods, seeing the tentacles in them, the fact that he seems surprised to see Lou on the Magellan, which, why would he leave his house if Lou's pod was at the house? Sam just doesn't strike me as someone that would have left Lou's pod in the bunker if he had any idea that Lou was in the pod, like we see with the whole like chiral image and the tentacles. I just can't imagine a father who raised her for over a year, it seems, in the game footage, would just leave the pod at the house. So I'm just curious, does the pod disappear and then he calls Fragile, or Fragile shows up because maybe the pod has appeared on her ship? Something fishy is going on. Let me know your theories, and I'm sorry that half of this was about Egyptian mythos. I really hope that you guys have some ideas, or just something that you can add to that conversation, because I'm always curious about the Egyptian mythos and Higgs. I think I'll leave off with, I have an idea for a theory video that I was discussing with a friend about Sam not being a Christ figure like I had originally thought of him as, but as Moses, who was a great deliverer of his people from the pharaohs. And of course we have the pharaoh themed Higgs, and Sam saving people from Higgs in a way, but also the massacre of babies in Egypt, and how we had this slaughter of babies and the death of children and sacrificing children. So I think that there is something that could be said thematically there. And if you guys are interested in hearing more about maybe the Egyptian mythos and how it might relate to Death Stranding 1 and Death Stranding 2, I'd be happy to kind of put out a lore video about that. But we will continue on with the trailer on Tuesday, and I apologize if you heard any rain or noise in the background. Today was kind of a weird day. for filming a video, but I didn't want to miss getting a video out on Thursday, so I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I hope that you guys can add something to the conversation below. All right, bye!